So this video is part 2 of my talk about the new external note mode in Continuum firmware 8.50 and also how that relates pretty much exclusively here for me with the CME Xkey37. And this CME is an interesting MIDI controller because its pressure is kind of in the same range that the Continuum pressure is. It's a very light sort of pressure. And also its aftertouch can happen almost immediately after the onset of note on. So that means that you can play into the aftertouch quite quickly. Normally on a MIDI keyboard, if it has aftertouch, it's usually just the channel pressure. It's not the polyphonic one, the aftertouch. But if it does have aftertouch, it's in a range that's sort of on the bottom end of the keybed travel. So you're always traveling through to get to that aftertouch area, and typically that aftertouch requires a fair amount of pressure, greater than normally what you would play the Continuum. So when you're playing back and forth between the keybed and the Continuum surface, it makes for a little bit of an unnatural feel that you're having to change your finger pressure so much. So I have tweaked some of the settings for the Xkey, and they're a little bit different from the settings that are saved with the firmware. But I mean, it's something that if you're going to get into this, you're going to have to play around with it yourself. But I'll basically just go through it step by step here, and it's pretty darn straightforward. If I go over here first to key sensitivity, typically this is the default settings for it. So I haven't changed anything. I couldn't find any benefit in changing any of these settings for the keys or the filter type. I experimented with these different filters. I wasn't really hearing how it was going to affect the playing experience. You can experiment with turning down the noise floor. It defaults to 4, but you know, just you can bring it down to 3 and just look for any sort of false notes, as they say, spurious data with that kind of lower setting. And if you do notice it, then you just back it up off to 4. The lower it goes, the more sensitive and immediate it's going to be. Now with the timings, here I'm going to reset these to default. So these are the default settings, and there are some things that you're going to want to change. I just sped up all this modulation pitch period, aftertouch period, and smooth note trigger time. So now, especially with the aftertouch, notice here it's 10 milliseconds, so you're going to get a new aftertouch value every 10 milliseconds. This one is an important one to change because this is the delay time between when the note starts and also when the note starts and when the aftertouch first starts reading. Defaults to 120 milliseconds. Just bring that right up to 10 milliseconds. So now that aftertouch will kick in right away. What else did I change here? Nothing on the miscellaneous page. The key assignment. Oh yes, okay. So what I did was I created 2 curves in the velocity curves area. There's one for the keys, which is kind of like a squared function, and then the aftertouch is a similar thing. Just sort of drew those in. That's my preferred response curve. You may have something you find better. In the key assignments, what is important here is that, well, of course, I think it defaults to MIDI channel 1, and we also want the modulation parameter here to be 1. You can use that. If it's set to CC1, you can use that modulation button or the pedal input on the expression to change the Y value inside the EGA matrix sound. You also want to select this button here. The aftertouch follows the user curve. Otherwise, I think it just gives you a linear line. And also, you want the first aftertouch value to follow note velocity. So what that means is these aftertouch values, which are going to express the Z parameter, typically the amplitude of the Continuum sound. If you set it to note value, and let's suppose you strike a key and it has a level of 30, then 10 milliseconds later, that first aftertouch value is going to be at 30. Otherwise, it might start at 1, or it might start at a different value than where you were. So this makes for a smooth transition using the aftertouch. So in Max, I made this little utility, and it's here. And what this does is I wanted to get sort of a running graph here of the Z, the Y, and the X. Well, the X is not that important for this, and the Y is not so much either, but especially the Z. I wanted to look at what the data was like coming out of the Xkey and out of the Continuum. So right now I've set this window here to 10 seconds. I've set up my ports, so I have my Xkey connected here, and I'm reading the Continuum's MIDI interface right there. And when I press a key, I'm going to get readings from the Z, the Y, and also deviations of 100 cent range of the X. So here's a note. I'm just going to change my sound back here to the first one I was using. Yeah, that one. Okay. So let's try that again here. So a couple things you can look at this. I was trying to create a smooth arc in volume and play relatively stable on the Continuum surface in the Y, not so much in the X direction. I wasn't really paying super attention to that. But take a look at this data here. You can look at this and you can see that the Continuum does a really good job of expressing those Z values. It's really smooth. Everything's in order. Very nice. In the Y direction, remember the Y is not as accurate, absolutely accurate as the Z. So you can tell at the beginning when the pressure is low, and at the end when the pressure is low, it has a little bit harder time resolving exactly where the Y is. And bear in mind that when I design sounds for the Continuum, Y is applied appropriately because Y has really good relative accuracy, just not the absolute. So it's something actually to be taken advantage of in terms of sound design versus the weight control you can get from Z, or that's kind of very fine X control. Okay, so that graph again, I'll do a smooth one. Okay, so take a look at what's coming out of the Xkey. I'm going to try to play as smoothly as I can. Oh, let's get another one here. I accidentally untriggered that. Okay, so you can see the X is absolutely right on pitch because there is no pitch deviation unless I use the pitch bend. There's no Y information. Y is always at 0 because I didn't play any modulation. And the Z, you can see it has that general shape, but you can see a lot more irregularities where as it's reading up and it's reading down. Really hard to get rid of that kind of artifact in the Z. So that's why in the Xkey editor, parameters can be specifically tailored to respond to an external note input or to the Continuum surface input. So I just want to show another thing that you're going to see. If I move this window down small, now we're seeing 1 second, and I'll play the Continuum note. You see that, and even if I play it fast, even when it's fast, there's always this rise up at the beginning. And this is this attack portion of the sound. And it'll come into play when I play the string sound later, and it also explains why all the sounds in the Xkey, all the system presets, were just not automatically set up for external note mode. They actually have to be custom programmed to take care of it, because something that has an attack phase, like let's say one of the violin, viola, cello, bass sounds, it sounds weird when you play it on the X key, because the X key is going to jump right to an initial value. See, you're just getting none of that attack phase. It's just basically switching right on. So let's take if you listen to the sound that I'm working with now, we can get rid of this. And what I've done is this is actually a very simple sound. We're listening to, right now, oscillator 1. It's being controlled by pitch. It's coming out here. The finger pressure is controlling its output. And its spectrum, that's up here, this spectral balance is being controlled by finger pressure. Okay, so it's very straightforward. It's going from 0 to 0.8. So when I play a note, the spectrum, the finger spectrum, when I first start, it's going to be at 0, and then if I bottom out on the surface all the way down, it's going to be at 0.8. And so it sounds like a filter change, really. And I'll play that on the X key now. So you hear a little unevenness. Sounds a bit grainy because you actually can hear the jumps in the spectrum changing. So here's an example of if I was going to control an X key, a sound with the X key in this kind of manner, I would change the parameters around. So this second oscillator demonstrates the first change in those parameters. So now I'm activating this second oscillator. And let's take a look at this formula B. When you look at it now, it's got the same 0 to 0.8 in the Z control, but I've activated a blend over here. And the blend is being controlled with external notes. So that means there's going to be a different value for certain parameters that are in the formula, whether it's coming from the continuum surface or it's coming from the external MIDI note control, the X key in this case. So you toggle this switch here. I'm looking at this secondary, and the only change that's happening here is the interpolation is turned up a fair amount for the X key versus the default value for the continuum. And when you do that, that's kind of like this slew, so it's going to kind of smooth everything over, and it's going to smooth out all those changes. So now when I play this note, I'm getting a smoother response. It's not quite as good, of course, as the continuum, but it's kind of, you can see that I've programmed something custom for the X key to make it work within the sound design that I'm trying to do. But because it's slewed, now the attacks are going to be slow versus this. Very fast. That's as fast as that can go. So here's another programming trick you can do. And I have this set up on the third oscillator here. Okay, activate the third oscillator. We have two formulas. We have a C formula and a D formula. They're being added together to control that spectral balance. In this oscillator, same oscillators in all three of these. And I've also got a shape generator set up. So whenever the finger goes down, this shape generator is going to be triggered once. See the single cycle mode that I'm in. And it's going to go over 1 second. So what I've done here is I have a formula that I have the same 0 to 0.8 set within this pressure, the Z area. It's being multiplied by a ramp that goes from 1 to 0. And so this ramp goes down from 1 to 0 over the course of this 1 second right here. So as that ramp goes down, once it goes down to 0, it stays there, and that means 0 times anything is 0, so this formula outputs nothing after 1 second. And when we look at the blend control over here and look at the values for this primary and secondary, what I've done is in this secondary control, it's got an interpolation of 40, which is the default. So it's going to be much faster in terms of its response time. But then this entire formula does nothing after 1 second, gradually diminishes out. So you add another formula that is ramped up. And so it starts at 0, has no influence when the note first starts, but after 1 second it's full. And this one, again, it has that change in that secondary, so the interpolation is high. So it's kind of like you're cross-fading two formulas. One very responsive but short, and then the other one is going to be that smooth. So now I can get, because of the note start, I can get those fast attacks. But still take advantage of that smoother control on sustained notes. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to that phenomena that we had with, you know, the over here. So that attack portion that we see here in that in the Z from the continuum surface versus, see, it's just impossible to get it, really impossible to get it to go to 0. Just really, really hard. So there's always going to be a shape that it starts at a non-zero point, it seems like, no matter how softly you try to touch it. It's reading that aftertouch quickly. So, you know, the aftertouch, it's just, even if you get a note velocity of 0, the aftertouch is really quick right away, and there's just no shape to it. So if you have a sound like this is just the standard violin, viola, cello, bass sound, number 4, but I changed the note process to external note. And now you can hear this in effect when we have play the sound here. And that same sound played on the Xkey. So there's some problems with this sound with external note mode. There's no attack phase. The sound wasn't designed to have some kind of automatic shape generator starting at the top. It's designed to use finger pressure to create that shape. And also there's way too much volume control on the with control through the Xkey. So I mean, this sound to me is an exact perfect example of why note processing, you don't want to have it normally on. It has to be a real special case scenario where you want to take advantage of something that a key bed switched would be able to give you that that you're not exactly going to have with the Continuum. Okay, so here's my summary for the Xkey37. Point number 1, it has really good ergonomics and it integrates really nicely with the Continuum surface. I've got those brackets, so it's really, really close. So that makes it easy to transfer back and forth between the Continuum playing surface and the Xkey playing surface. And that's not a trivial thing. Number 2, the MIDI response speed is quite adequate. It's a good controller. It feels very solid. I feel like the if the jitter is very low, so it feels like I can predict what I'm going to play with the Xkey. It has, number 3, it has polyphonic aftertouch, and that's rare for a MIDI controller. Most of them just have channel pressure. Not many controllers seem to want to implement the polyphonic one. It isn't used very often, so can't blame manufacturers for that. Number 4, the pressure range. It's similar to the Continuum's pressure range. So when you're going back and forth from playing the Continuum surface to the Xkey, your finger response is going to be quite similar rather than trying to go to another controller that maybe is of kind of a weighted action, and the aftertouch is in the bottom range of the key, it's going to be a completely different playing experience, completely different. Number 5, it's relatively inexpensive and easily available. It's ubiquitous. You can find them anywhere. Number 6, it has the ability to generate good Y values, which I really didn't go into very much in this video, but you can hook up an expression pedal to it and map it so that this expression pedal can control globally all the Y values for the Xkey component of a MIDI notes going into the Continuum. So that is actually a useful thing, because then you can sort of swell things with a nice controlled pedal and still have independent control playing the Continuum surface. And number 7, you have to do custom EGA matrix programming is to take advantage of external note mode, just because of all the differences between the way the key responds and the quality of the polyphonic of the aftertouch. These things have to be taken into account, because otherwise the sounds are designed for the Continuum surface, which is, you know, in a whole nother class of control. So custom programming has to happen. And number 8, I find it most useful as a complement to the Continuum, because it allows you to change the programming, do special things. Maybe with, you know, for me with my left hand, I'm not very good playing polyphonically without rounding in tune, so I can concentrate. My left hand can be quantized, and my right hand can perform. I can also get small intervals. I can get unisons and micro detunes and semitone intervals by using a combination of an Xkey external note input and the Continuum surface. But having said all that, the best thing you can do is number 9, practice the Continuum. It's really time well spent. I'm very prejudiced about this, but it's the best expressive electronic controller ever built, and it's a shame to spend time exploring alternate things when there's just so much to explore with the Continuum. So if you put in the practice hours, then you can reward yourself by exploring other things like external note mode. So hope you found this video enjoyable and helpful. See you later.